Welcome to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you, and He loves you so very much, He gave everything for you. Please don't ever forget that. And that we are on a journey to find the truth. And I hope at the end of this journey that what we'll reach the conclusion of is something that will take us a gigantic step closer to finding that Creator who loved you so very much He gave everything for you. I know I'm presupposing a little bit that when we get to the end of this journey, the weight of the evidence will support the idea that, in fact, the best explanation for our existence is an intelligent Creator. I hope you can see the handwriting on the wall at this point, that that's where we're heading. But at the end of this journey is not, I remember quoting a few weeks ago from Arthur Eddington that, frankly, the idea of a beginning point raised, philosophical issues that he considered to be repugnant. That is not what we're after here. At the end of this journey is the greatest discovery of them all, that the Creator of the universe loved you so very much He gave everything for you. You personally, not just mankind corporately, but you personally. And I hope you find that relationship. I hope every day that you find that relationship, and keeping you in prayer, my friend. All right, now, this week, I don't want this to come across too harsh this week. This week, we're going to really give Charles Darwin kind of a workover on some problems and how he addressed things. I've mentioned in previous episodes, Darwin does an amazing job painting pictures. But I think he gets a free pass far too often on issues that are of tremendous importance that we have to look at, and we really have to be honest in terms of the flaws with which he approached these ideas. And I think we need to maybe pull back a little bit in this journey and address some things that he just quite frankly gets a pass on that he simply should not. And that's what we're going to look at with this week's episode. If we're climbing, as Richard Dawkins indicated, to the top of Mount Improbable, does Charles Darwin actually start at the bottom of the mountain, or did he find a clever way to skip halfway up the mountain and then start from halfway? And I think what you're going to find is that he's played a clever little, I don't want to say game in all this, and I don't want to come across as finger pointing or anything like that. But I think what you'll find is Darwin does not start at the bottom of Mount Improbable. Darwin skips around some very important steps in the process and begins halfway up. And that's going to be an issue. Now, I want to illustrate this and talk about several things that I have not been happy with Charles Darwin's arguments on. And I want to go back to how he approached specifically problems in the fossil record. Because again, I think he gets a pass on a lot of this. I just want to put this one quote out there and break this down a little bit to illustrate some of the things that he does and the assumptions that he makes in support of his theory that are not valid assumptions to make. And one of the best is this quote from his book, and he says, and this is addressing the Cambrian explosion. He says, "The abrupt manner in which whole groups of species suddenly appear in certain formations has been argued by several paleontologists as a fatal objection to the belief in the transmutation of the species." So this is the tree of life. "If numerous species belonging to the same genre or families have really started into life at once, the fact would be fatal to the theory of evolution through natural selection." I want you to let that soak in for a minute. If you have something like the Cambrian explosion, where all of a sudden life just leaps onto the scene, there's not a slow, gradual progression of life. Life leaps onto the scene, very developed, and moves forward from that point, then that's a problem. And he says that would be fatal to the theory of evolution through natural selection. His words, okay? The problem is that's what the fossil record shows. And the problem was in the 1860s, that's still what the fossil record showed. When he released his book, it's exactly what the fossil record showed. His argument was the fossil record was incomplete and erroneous. For the development by this means of a group of forms, all of which are descended from some one progenitor, must have been an extremely slow process, and the progenitors must have lived long before their modified descendants. Okay, makes perfect sense. But we continually overrate the perfection of the geological record and falsely infer because of certain genre or families have not been found beneath a certain stage, that they did not exist before that stage. Okay. So if what you find over here on this side is nothing, 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 or just, nothing really important, nothing closely related, you've got a very few things, and all of a sudden, boom, most life as we know it jumps onto the stage in a highly evolved state of existence. So you've got a very few items over here. There's some evidence of life. There's a little bit of stuff here and there. And then, boom, there is a massive explosion, a Cambrian explosion, where life in enormous diversity and well-evolved jumps onto the scale. Again, he says we overrate the perfection of the geological record. So he's blaming it again on the fossil record is just undiscovered yet. But here's the problem in his argument. In all cases, positive paleontological evidence may be implicitly trusted. Negative evidence is worthless as experience has so often shown. That is philosophically a terrible argument. And if we are generous with him and we say, okay, what he's really trying to get at here is the fossil record is imperfect, give it more time, and what we've seen is the discoveries will be made and my theory will be proven true. Trust me on this. The obvious glaring problem in all of that is if you take negative evidence to your theory and you simply throw it out, what you've done is you haven't analyzed the real issue, which is, what if the negative evidence is accurate? Because here we are, that was 1859 when The Origin of Species was written. We're 160 years later. The Cambrian record stands in defiance of Charles Darwin's theory. His statement has never proven itself to be true. So he throws out negative evidence and says, cannot be trusted. It's worthless. What did he say? Negative evidence is worthless as experience has so often shown. 160 years later, that is not the case. You cannot throw out the negative evidence because the negative evidence absolutely decimates your theory unless you have positive evidence that you can put in place to support why that gaping hole in your theory is not true. But he skips over it. And like I said, philosophically, I think that's a terrible approach. But in the arena of ideas, I don't know how he got away with that argument. In the arena of ideas, I'm sure his peers jumped on him at that point and said, Charles, you can't make that case. You can't just throw out negative evidence without some good reason to throw the evidence out. And here we are 160 years later. The tree of life is a joke and does not support any of that. Now, where we're going tonight with that is this idea of the development of complex organisms. Again, we've been talking about this whole idea of climbing Mount Improbable. Richard Dawkins' parable of how these complex body parts could have arisen, right? Okay, so here's our problem in all of this. At the time, Darwin also knew that this was an issue, and he tried to address it, and one of the things that kept popping up was this idea of the human eye. Because even in the 1860s, and I've got a pair of glasses here, what we knew, because as we get older, our eyes don't work as well as they used to, but because of things like glasses, and more importantly, telescopes, we knew even in the 1860s that what was going on inside of our eyes was tremendously complex. Because not only can we see close up, but we can see far away. I could when I was younger. I can't as well as I do now. I can't as well now as I used to when I was younger. But we can see close up, we can see far away, we can do all of these things. Our eyes have this incredible ability to focus. Our eyes do all of these incredible things. And even in the 1800s, when Darwin was writing this book, there was criticism pointed to him on this issue. How do you, through natural selection, explain the evolution of something as incredibly complex as the human eye? And I love this quote from The Origin of Species. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Here's his response, but I can find out no such case. That's a bold statement. I'm not entirely sure that that's accurate, Mr. Darwin, but let's take a look at that. So to make his case, what he's going to have to do is he's going to have to analyze something. And then he's going to have to go all the way back to a proper beginning point, not a middle point, but a beginning point. And say, okay, let's look at the beginning point of, in this case, our eyes, vision. And that's what we've been talking about. On top of Mount Improbable is not only the starting point is the idea, but then the end point, ultimately, when we get up there, is going to be a developed eye. And along the way, as we're going up Mount Improbable, we start with not only the idea that gets us going, but we start with the most simplistic vision, the apparatus possible to develop vision. And by the time we get to the top, we have a fully developed eye, probably not ours, probably something like an eagle or something like that that puts us to shame. And that's where we're going in this journey. Again, he can find no such case. We'll see if that holds up a little bit. All right, so here comes his argument, because he recognizes this is a problem for him, even in 1859. To suppose that the eye, with all of its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, things like that, for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. All right, let's pause for a minute in this quote. So he's recognizing all of these working parts that we recognize are going on in our eye. And what does he list? Think about this for a minute. Adjusting the focus to different distances, admitting in different amounts of light, the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, all of these things. How do all of these things happen by a natural selection? Because if you think about what it takes to build a telescope is a complex device, and you have to have all these different lenses and things and all these different focal arrangements to bring into view the moon or the stars or something else like that, or the planets. If we think about what was going on in Darwin's day, he knew, and he recognized you've got differences in color, you've got focus, you've got, all these different things coming together. And he says there, how all of this could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. Okay, so what he's going to do now, what he needs to do now is go all the way back to the very beginning of the process and find something in the very earliest stage. Is that what he does? Yeah, spoiler alert, he doesn't. Reason tells me that if numerous graduations from a simple and imperfect eye to one complex and perfect can be shown to exist, each grade being useful to its possessor, as is certainly the case, if further the eye ever varies, and the variations be inherited, as is likewise certainly the case, and if such variations could be useful to any animal under changing conditions of life, then the difficulty believing that a perfect and complex eye could be formed by natural selection through though inseparable by our imagination, should not be considered as subversive of the theory. Okay, that's a whole lot of problems right there. And did you notice what he started to slide in right here at the very first? Reason tells me that if numerous graduations, okay, wait, he's going to start at the beginning, right? Right? Reason tells me that if numerous graduations from a simple and imperfect eye, well, he just put an eye on the table. How simple and imperfect is he talking about? Because he's already started with a functioning eye. That's not going to work. You can't start with an imperfect item. You can't say, I'm going to begin with something that already exists. But we're going to keep going here. It's possible for him to slide back into this right. I mean, don't get me wrong. Let's see where he goes with this, and how does he define this simple and imperfect eye? Because, well, it's a functioning eye, but it's just not very complex yet. You don't get to just put on the table a functioning eye. That's not the beginning. That's part way up Mount Improbable, okay? So let's see what he did, because it feels to me like he just snuck around here. If I go back and look and say, my first car was a 1960s vintage vehicle, That's not the beginning of automobiles. It was my first car. It was a very simple car. It pales in comparison to the car that I drive today. That's not the beginning of automobiles. The beginning of automobiles goes all the way back again into the 1800s, horseless carriage. So if I'm trying to figure out the history of automobiles, I'm not going to start midway through the process. So you notice what he says here. He also mentions that each grade being useful to its possessor, and I think a little further down he says, and if such variation should be useful to any animal under changing conditions of life. That's important, but I also don't understand that, and we've mentioned that along the way. Both Darwin and Dawkins both have admitted that evolution is a miserly accountant, Richard Dawkins' words, and none of them are going to allow for this extravagant waste. How is it that a malfunctioning eye is useful in the evolutionary process? Wouldn't it be discarded along the way? I mean, I understand that a partially functioning eye is okay. I mean, my eyes partially function and I throw these on and it's way better. But a partially functioning eye, depending on where it is, again, unless the creature possesses the intelligence to drive the evolutionary process, it's awful difficult to understand how that could continue being. But anyway, I go down a rabbit hole there. Let's see where he goes. Does he go back to the very beginning on this? How a nerve comes to be sensitive to light hardly concerns us more than how life itself originated. I think you can see where he's going here. How a nerve comes to be sensitive to light hardly concerns us more than how life itself originated. Really? You're not at all worried about how life originated. That's interesting. I admit, 1859, didn't know about the cell, didn't know about DNA. You'd think the beginning of life would be important to someone who's writing the book, The Origin of Species. And this is intended to tell us where all life began, but he's just said he's not concerned about where life began. The irony of that is genuinely remarkable. But again, you can see where the end game is coming here. How a nerve comes to be sensitive to light hardly concerns us. Ouch. So we're going to just put on the table a light-sensitive nerve, and we're not going to worry about how it got there. That doesn't seem to me like we're playing fair. That feels like we're starting partway up Mount Improbable. We're not starting at the beginning, Mr. Darwin. Yeah. But I may remark that as some of the lowest organisms in which nerves cannot be detected are capable of perceiving light, it does not seem impossible that certain sensitive elements in their sarcode should become aggregated and develop into nerves endowed with this special sensitivity. All right, so this is where he's going. He has put on the table a light-sensitive nerve, and this is where he's going to go. The simplest organ, which can be called an eye, okay, good, here we go, consists of an optic nerve, that's problematic, surrounded by pigmented cells and covered by translucent skin, but without any lens or other refractive body. Okay, so now he's put on the table. This is his starting point. Now, the interesting thing is, if he put this on the table and said, this is the most simple thing that we could actually call an eye. Let's talk about how it got here. That's actually a really good analysis. I would love to hear that. But he doesn't. He puts that on the table as his starting point. He doesn't say, if we had an optic nerve surrounded by pigmented cells and covered by translucent skin, how would that have evolved? That would have been a really interesting place for him to go. He simply puts it on the table and said, well, it's there. The optic nerve, again, is a nerve that is connected to a portion of the brain that can translate the information that it's sending into useful, purposeful knowledge. Okay, it's the optic nerve. So it's taking information from the eye eventually to the brain, and it's doing something useful with it. How does that happen? That just occurred? So you've got to have a functioning brain, you've got to have a functioning nerve that is running information to the brain that the brain finds useful and can translate that information. And in this case, it's going to be a light-sensitive nerve. But again, pigmented cells covered by a translucent skin. All of that, again, you've got 3 different working parts bare minimum, and they all just happen to come together. Isn't that amazing? But he doesn't explain to us how that happened. He just skips partway up Mount Improbable and he starts walking. And this is the problem. Darwin just pulled this little maneuver and he's been allowed to get away with it. He does not explain. He recognizes the human eye is a problem. And we've got to explain how it could have gotten there. And he says, if you start at the most simple eye and you work your way forward, no. Where did the most simple eye come from? He says here, the difficulty ceases to be very great in believing that natural selection may have converted the simple apparatus of an optic nerve coated with a pigment and invested by a translucent membrane into an optical instrument as perfect as possessed by a member of the articulate class. So if you just think about where it could have started and then it got eventually better, it's easy to understand. And this is the problem. We can all understand microevolution, where we see one group of dogs being bred into a different group of dogs. We can see this, and we allow that picture to be taken all the way back further than it should. You can't take and say, I understand how one dog can be bred into a different dog. You can go there, but what you can't go back and say is, I understand how at some point you have this initial cell which eventually became a tree, a cat, a dog, and a rabbit. In between those things, there's a hurdle here that you can't leap. And what we've allowed is, once the dog exists, we understand how the dog could change, but at some point as you trace it back, there has to be a first dog. And that's highly problematic. So again, I think we allow Charles Darwin a little bit of a sleight of hand here, and I'm going to mark it up to bad philosophy, not bad sportsmanship and all of this, but I don't think in the arena of ideas it's a very effective argument just to skip ahead and say, well, if we start halfway up Mount Improbable, then it's easy to understand how we could get there. Number one, I disagree. And actually, Darwin had to address this another page later. He says, it's been objected that in order to modify an eye and still preserve it as a perfect instrument, many changes would have to be effected simultaneously, which, it is assumed, could not be done through natural selection. But, as I have attempted to show in my work on the variation of domestic animals, it is not necessary to suppose that the modifications were all simultaneous if they were extremely slight and gradual. I'm sorry, but just taking it slowly doesn't really help. And we're going to see that as we start really addressing this question of irreducible complexity. And he's dipping his toe into that issue now. We're going to see this. The problem that you have with our eye, when you talk about all of these different things that he recognizes, differing amounts of light, differing focus, all of these things, if we compare our eye to a telescope, we kind of start to recognize, well, if you just have one functioning piece and the rest of the telescope doesn't work, what do you have? You don't have anything, you have junk. A partially functioning telescope is not a telescope. It doesn't work. So if you have to wait for focus to ever happen, then what good is the eye that you have? How do you go from, while feeding information into the brain for a million years that's blurry and out of focus, all of a sudden natural selection figures out how to come up with a vehicle to make it in focus? I guess you could make the argument that creature developed further and survived better because what it could see was more in focus and it could see the predator coming to get it. I don't understand how the predator could see to catch it. At some point, somebody's got to evolve a good eye here. And if nobody can see to any varying degree other than blurry or light or dark, how does that ever get better? Again, we just assume, well, important functions like that eventually just got better and better. Well, how does natural selection know what is better? We talked about that again a few weeks ago. Natural selection, not that smart. It's not a guided process. It's an unguided process. So where does this come from? And why has Darwin been allowed to start partway up the mountain? Why does he get to start with a light-sensitive patch? I want to address one more thing before we wrap up the podcast, because I'm sure there are some who are frustrated saying, Darwin did exactly what he set out to do. He started with a simple eye and he brought it all the way forward to a complex eye. His description is accurate, and Richard Dawkins' description of climbing Mount Improbable is also accurate. And I disagree respectfully. And the reason I do, I want to go back to something I said earlier. You can't just start with a functioning simple eye. You've got to be able to explain. I think he had 3 parts that Charles Darwin looked at. He said the simplest organ which can be called an eye consists of an optic nerve surrounded by pigmented cells and covered by translucent skin. That's three very specific things. And not only do they have to come together, they have to come together in such a way that they're transmitting useful information to the brain that can be interpreted as data for vision, okay? So even if it's the most simplistic eye in the world, you've skipped past how it came together. And again, I hope we're not relying on luck. They could have just come together, it could have just happened. You're going to have to do that for every single functioning body part that we have. Sense of smell, sense of taste, your vision, your balance, motor functions, all of these other skills, reproduction. We're going to talk about reproduction a lot. But this is where you cross that barrier, as I mentioned before, into the realm of irreducible complexity. Even the most simple eye that he describes, this simple organ called an eye, consisting of an optic nerve surrounded by pigmented cells and covered by translucent skin. That just happened. That just happened. It all just came together. And it doesn't matter how it came together, it just came together. Really? That's something that's developed. And if we go by what Darwin and Dawkins previously told us about how miserly of an accountant natural selection is, then why, as it's developing and building up, it doesn't work? Why is it that the body allows this malfunctioning, non-functional future eye, how is it allowed to develop to a point where we can say it just came together? Well, in the process of it just coming together, the body should be getting rid of it because it's wasting critical resources that the body otherwise needs. And it doesn't work until it becomes a simple functioning eye. So again, you still haven't answered the question, how did we go from nothing to the simple functioning eye? And I hate to keep going back to the idea that luck got us there. So trust me, I understand the argument. I understand what Darwin is trying to say. Those things just came together is where he's trying to go. He's skipping past it by saying those things just came together. And I don't think you can do that. I really don't. If we actually held his feet to the fire and said, no, you have to take it all the way back to the beginning, there's no good explanation how you begin the journey up Mount Improbable. There just simply isn't. Thank you for joining us this week. Really appreciate you being here with us. If you like this week's episode, I hope you'll consider hitting the like button. If you like the podcast, and I hope you do, I hope you'll consider hitting the subscribe button. You can find our podcasts on YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify. You can find us on our website at proof2grace.com, and you can reach out to us via email at proof2grace@yahoo.com if you've got any questions. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.